Hello everyone, this is Venom Geek Media here, and today, well, we're doing another revisiting of an old series. This time, we're going to be revisiting the Cardassian Border Wars. No, I haven't run out of ideas. Shut up, it's fine. Don't worry about it. Totally original ideas here on this channel. But yeah, we're going to be revisiting the Cardassian Border Wars. Why? Well, because it's just occurred to me that was over 5 years ago. Doesn't time fly? And when I made that series, I didn't have channel members. I didn't have a members Discord. So all that I did for research was use memory beta and my own intuition. Since that time, a lot of investigations have since been done into that time period. We've re-examined a lot of the dating around that period. We've looked in depth at the ambassador class. We've recently looked at starship construction. We've looked at Cardassian history. And we've looked at the Stargazer scandal. All of which brings into this question, which you will see by the title of the video. Was the Federation actually pulling punches during the Cardassian Border War? This is a very common sentiment, expressed not in least by certain members of Starfleet, such as Captain Maxwell, who very clearly seemed to think that Starfleet was pulling punches in the Border War and did not himself feel that he should pull any punches. And this is a sentiment that is also very frequently shared by the audiences of the Cardassian Border War. In fact, I would say that when I wrote the series, I probably did think that Starfleet was pulling its punches. But on a more complete and in-depth analysis, is that actually true? Knowing what we know now, does that claim really stand up? It's a very popular sentiment, but it's a bit like lions led by donkeys. Does it actually stack up to the reality on the ground of the time period? So that's what we're going to answer today. Was the Federation pulling punches in the Cardassian Border War? Now, this is going to involve going back through the timeline of the Border War. There will be some retcons. What I will say is what I said with regards to the Romulan Earth War. If you like my series, don't let this affect it. And that a lot of these retcons are doing for particular purposes, and that overall I still stand by that series. I'm not saying that it's decanonized or anything. What I'm saying, though, is that we'd perhaps reorder and reshuffle events, and that would recontextualize things. So, without any further ado, let's begin. So the first question we should actually ask with regards to the Cardassian Border War is, when did it start? Now, on the face of it, this seems to be a bit of an innocuous question, but there is a point to it. Now, when I made the series, I put it at 2347. This is because that is what Memory Beta says. This is because that is supposedly when the Setlik III massacre was. This is because of an incorrect dating of the Setlik III massacre. Let's just think about this for a second. If 2347 was when the Setlik III massacre took place, that would put it at 20 years prior to TNG. 20 years prior to the Wounded. So, what, you're telling me that O'Brien was even in Starfleet 20 years ago? I mean, I know he's a mature chap, but I don't think he's that old. And similarly, that Benjamin Maxwell not only was in Starfleet, but was also a captain, which then raises the question, why isn't he an admiral by now? So, you get to that question, it's like, hang on, that doesn't make sense with the age of the characters. And then you're also bearing in mind that going back to 2347, that means that the Rutledge was present at the Battle of Setlik III, a New Orleans class ship. That brings the New Orleans very early, and this will come back to. But we actually have better evidence from DS9's episode Tribunal. The dialogue in Tribunal indicates that it was in fact 8 years ago. So that would be 2362. Which is about 2 years prior to TNG. This makes the Wounded 5 years after the massacre of Setlik III. It's long enough to satisfy the Picard line of being angry for so long, but also recent enough that as a loss for Maxwell, it still is very raw and very personal, rather than 20 years, which makes it just like, move on, man, come on. So, why is this date important? Well, because we know that the Setlik III attack was a sneak attack. It was a preemptive strike as far as the Cardassians were concerned. And this indicates that actually, so what, the Cardassian Border War only took place in 2362? Well, no, but that there was a series of conflicts that flared up periodically, and that 2362 was likely the final phase of the Border War. And you can well imagine that in 2362 to 2367, which is when the Wounded takes place, that there was a border war going on in the background, but at that point, then you have the Galaxy-era ships, Freedoms, Niagaras, Challengers, all of that, and you can imagine that actually slapping down the Cardassians was a lot easier in that particular instance. So ultimately, it makes sense in terms of the personnel. It means that O'Brien has not been in Starfleet for over 20 years, which is a long time, and that the New Orleans class can come a little bit later, probably in the 2350s when it should. And what this also means is that we can start the Cardassian Border Wars earlier, because we now no longer have a strict date to adhere to. Now, this has several implications, because potentially the Cardassian Border Wars could start when there were few to almost no Ambassador-class ships, and this will come into with the matchups. No Highlighter-era ships. Does that mean we can drag the Kulinor and Ekor back a little bit? We can have them not just around in the 50s, but perhaps earlier, in which case then the tech gap between the Federation and the Cardassians is smaller. There's all these possibilities, which then make the Border War a more interesting conflict. Now, I think realistically, I don't see the Cardassian Border War starting any earlier than the 2330s. We know that the military takes control of Cardassia around about 2320, and that similarly that's when the occupation of Bajor begins. Technically, it formally is recognized later on, but as far as the Bajorans are concerned and Bajoran history, it begins in 2320. So make of that what you will, but that's certainly when the Cardassians make their aggressive turn. So with that in mind, you have to say allow for about 10 years for the tensions to build up to the point where the two powers are going to come to blows. So I don't see it any earlier than 2330. Now let's move to our next question, which is how many ambassador classes are in service? So this is important because the ambassador class is a trump card. In my post on Discord, one of my members, Birdmonster, pointed out that, well, I can solve the Cardassian Border War. I'm going to take 15 ambassador class ships and we'll just basically steamroll our way through anything that gets in our way. And indeed, if you could get 15 ambassador class ships, you basically steamroll your way through the entire Cardassian fleet. Sure. However, how many ambassadors are there actually for you to try and do that? Bear in mind, in this time period, the Kulinor and Ekor are the Cardassian top-of-the-line ships. The Kulinor is equivalent to the Miranda and actually possesses an advantage in maneuverability, so it's overall slightly better than a Miranda. And the Ekor, it has more firepower than the Excelsior, although it has a disadvantage in mobility. So about equal, but, with caveats. It's not a one-to-one matchup. That means that the Cardassians have perfect counters to the Miranda and the Excelsior class. So the other ships in play are the Highlighter-era ships. Cheyenne, Springfield, so on and so forth. Those are still very good ships, but they are quite lightweight. They're not big, powerful, heavy cruisers. They're very lightweight, medium ships. So, yes, the Ambassador class is a huge advantage. However, the Ambassador class has a lot of demands on its time, and there's probably not that many of them. As previously mentioned in the video on starship construction, you have this new nacelle design for the jumbo nacelles, which probably indicates a slower rate of production and fewer facilities. Now, the other thing that I mentioned in my rant on NCC numbers is that there seem to be two distinct blocks of ambassadors with two different prefixes. You have the original ambassadors, the USS Ambassador and Enterprise C, which have the 10 prefix, and the Yamaguchis, which have a 2 prefix. and these indicate a second run, possibly as a response to the Border War. Don't know, but we don't have a real idea of when those are built, and it's clear that obviously they are a second run of Ambassador class ships, and so likely are being built while the war is happening, so they don't have them ready to go immediately. So I suppose the question then becomes, well, how many original Ambassador class ships are there? Well, we know of 3 in canon: the USS Ambassador, the USS Enterprise, and the USS Horatio. It's likely that each of these were built at separate yards: the Ambassador at Antares, the Enterprise at San Francisco yards, and the Horatio at Utopia Planitia. If we take this as a baseline, we could probably suggest that 2 more were built at Andoria, another 2 at Vulcan, another 2 at Tela Prime, and then 1 at Beta Z Valeris Prime, another at Cation Prime, and another at Gaza Prime, indicating between 10 to 15 ships. Now, let's take that number of 10 to 15 Ambassador class ships and let's look at the obligations that Starfleet has in this time period. You still need to patrol the Klingon border, at least up till the late 2340s, because of the unstable nature of the Klingon Empire, and at that point there is no alliance. After the 2340s, after the Battle of Narendra III and the Kittima Massacre, then you get to have the alliance and you can presumably withdraw some of your deployments along that border, but until then you need to patrol that border and you need to take it seriously. Then you have the Romulan border, which is going to be a continuous concern, and you're going to need to dedicate a significant number of your ships, and your best ships at that, to patrolling and protecting this border. Then you have to have ships that are going around the core worlds, doing basic diplomacy and all that sort of stuff. Then you have your exploration and science duties. These are actually an important part of your security, because by actively engaging in science and exploration, you're building relations with other species, and you know what's coming. Then there's other threats that are also occurring at the same time as the Cardassians, the Tzenkethi, which are probably an equal, if not slightly greater threat than the Cardassians, depends on how they've developed technologically. Certainly we know that they were able to slap down the Cardassians back in the 23rd century, so if they've maintained that technological advantage, they're a lot closer to being a peer opponent for Starfleet. And then the Tellarians, who are indeed a lesser threat. So again, maybe you can pull some ships from there to deal with the Cardassians. So, that is a total of 5 obligations. If we take an even split between these different types of obligations, you get 3 ambassadors each, which means that at most, the Cardassia AO is going to get probably most of the time 1 ambassador, and at the best of times is only going to get 3 ambassador class ships. Now, I know what you're going to say. Well, maybe you've just underestimated the size of Starfleet. Well, this is where I kind of pin my flag and say I stand by Venomverse canon. Because I know via designing this war game that's being played out on my Discord as we speak, that Starfleet in the motion picture Wrath of Khan era is about 330 ships, give or take, not including auxiliary ships. And that is going to increase to somewhere in the excess of about 400 by next generation. That's by next generation, and so that's including all the Galaxy era ships, which for the purposes of this count obviously are not going to be applicable. So we're actually going to be counting up to 400 rather than over 400. So we've got our budget of about 400 ships. So we have to first ask, how many of these are new? And when I say new, I don't necessarily mean ambassadors and Cheyennes and everything. I also mean Excelsiors, because we're counting from the 2280s. We're counting from there. So technically, Excelsiors and the Excelsior era falls in as a new build. Bear that in mind. How many legacy ships? So that's basically Miranda's Constellations, No Births. These are the ships that seem to survive into the 24th century. Now, frankly, because we're talking about the early 24th century, the numbers could even be higher. But we know that at least 120 TMP era ships would likely still be around by TNG. From my numbers from the Tomed incident, which are very provisional and could easily be more, that With the Excelsior era, you're looking at about 90 ships. That then means that we have a budget for 75 Ambassador era ships. Now, I think there would be, in the Ambassador era, again, because of the complexities in the construction of the Ambassador, a lot of ships that would just continue to see construction with perhaps some slight modifications. So I think there's a lot of carryovers from the Excelsior era. So again, caveats on this number, but that's 75 ships, with then 115 Highlighter era ships. And that takes us to 400. And this means that just over a quarter of your fleet is old, outdated ships that the Cardassians can easily match. Easily match. 1-to-1. And also, let's just look at the most advanced era, the Highlighter era. So that includes the Splendor class, the Rigel class, Springfield class, Cheyennes, and Shi'kars. So it's a decent spread of ships, but all of which are relatively lightweight designs. And they're certainly not particularly powerful battleships. None of them are particularly powerful warships. But that just gives you a little bit of an indication of the fleet depth of the Federation. Now, let's go and look at the Cardassian fleet of the same time, going off again the canon of my Border Wars era, but also adding in other ships that I was perhaps reluctant to originally. So you have the Natel and Telok. These are older escorts, but actually for the time they're relatively recent. They were built in the 2320s, so they're relatively up to date, and they have the spiral wave disruptor, so they can do some damage. And they're certainly good as reconnaissance and skirmish assets, and probably the Cardassians have a fair number of them. And then as well as that, you also have the Borak, Hakalora, and Talor class cruisers, which are from the 2290s era and from the Talarian War era. And yeah, these aren't going to be so competitive, but they're good for second line support ships, certainly. And then you also have the Craxon, which is a equivalent to the Italian Mars torpedo boat, and is definitely overlooked in analysis of the Border War. We'll get to that in another video. And then, of course, finally, we have the Kulinors and Ekors. We know that in the Border Wars, Starfleet is deploying between 20 to 40 ships to the region, whereas the Cardassians are deploying up to 50 of their modern ships, so that would be Kulinors and Ekors, probably also Natels and Teloks if we're being generous, but those numbers would decrease, the proportions would decrease as the decades passed. And then they're also deploying these. They're also deploying Craxons. They're also deploying Boraks, Hakaloras, and Talors. So when you put that together, and you put together the fact that during the Border Wars, the Cardassians would have had a numbers advantage, and actually the tech advantage that Starfleet had is localized in only a handful of vessels, and the majority of vessels are only slightly better than their Cardassian counterparts, and or equal to their Cardassian counterparts. This is fundamentally my argument. And it is an argument. I'm not saying that I am definitively right. Please argue with me in the comments. But I am arguing that Starfleet, during the Cardassian Border Wars, wasn't pulling punches. They were allocating as much as they could spare to this conflict, without compromising any of their other security concerns. Starfleet is, it's defending everything. It has to defend everything in this era, so it can't really divert its forces to any one particular location because they don't know where the next threat is coming from. That's kind of the danger of peacetime, is that you can find yourself strategically overstretched because you don't know where the next threat vector is. I think people also overestimate the golden era of Starfleet. Let's point out that actually in this golden era, there's the Cardassian Border Wars. There's also the wars with the Talarians and the Zenkethi, which were probably actually all coordinated between these three powers so that Starfleet would never get to be able to mass 3 ambassadors against a threat. They wouldn't even be able to do that. That was probably something that they were doing and making sure to keep Starfleet off balance and preventing them from ever exerting the full might of their fleet. And so when you neutralize that threat of more advanced ships, it's being held up. Starfleet is being supported and held up by a lot of legacy vintage ships. At that point, it's not such a mismatch for the Cardassians. Yes, the Ambassador is an exceptional ship. It is a powerful ship, but it is not the rule for matchups in the Cardassian Border War. It is an exceptional ship. If you're a Cardassian and you come across an Ambassador class, you're incredibly unlucky and you're probably in for quite a bad day. But the majority of Cardassians during the Border War are not going to be fighting Ambassador class ships. They're probably going to be fighting either these high-tech, lightweight enemy vessels that are going to be difficult, but in numbers you should still probably be able to beat them back, and, Excelsiors and Mirandas, which that's perfect for you. That's a one-on-one easy fight. If you know what you're doing, you'll win. So, like I say, I think when we take all of that context into mind, the fact that the Border War takes place over a very long time frame, where both fleets are going through transition periods, and you take into account actually how few Grand Capital ships Starfleet actually has to allocate to this war, it then doesn't look so much like pulling punches and just essentially, as far as Starfleet's concerned, surviving. I think a good comparison to make, and this will connect us back to that video on Cardassian fascism, this is a lot like Italy versus Austria in World War I. One side is fighting multiple fronts, while the other side is devoting the entirety of its resources to just one. Which is then why at the end of the war, the Italians claim victory. Look, we collapsed the Austro-Hungarian Empire, because we were the last ones to fight them, forgetting the fact that the Austrian Empire had been spread thin, fighting multiple fronts against the Russians, a lot against the Russians, and also in the Balkans. And, I think it's much the same way with the Cardassian Border Wars. The Cardassians probably said, yeah, we win because, we could devote the entirety of our energy to this endeavor, while Starfleet could only plug holes in the dam as, they were being challenged on multiple fronts and being spread increasingly thin across these various obligations. So that's why Starfleet wasn't pulling punches in the Cardassian Border War. But what do you think? Let me know in the comments below. If you disagree with me, absolutely let me know. Good analysis of ships and capabilities would be very, very welcome. And I will see you all in the next video. Thank you to my members for supporting the channel. My glorious Navarks, Tully DT, Sean Farrell, Rella, and Macross Schaffer. My commanders, Jeff Hallam, Birdmonster, Adam Bowman, Philip Ty, Mark Philippe, Robert Kahn Strider, Gabe Logan, Martin McConville, Nicholas Walsh, JC Tech Wizard, Alcara Dreamer, Gloom Cookie, Der Monarch, and Jamal Soto. And I salute my Centurions, Marcus Hall, Pendlebury, Okolkatum Quaesto, Bird of Play D3, John Nicole, Julian Arnott, Freedom Trooper, Athie's Collection, Marzarine, Tobias Klein, Khan the Skektal Overlord, David Jackson, Guy Haslam, Andy Clark, and Quentin King. And I thank all my loyal sub-lieutenants. Thank you all for supporting the channel, and I will see you all in the next video.